At the end of June 1951, the United Nations offered to talk peace with North Korea. 2 days later, the Communists replied in kind. It was encouraging news. For the talks, the truce team settled on the tiny village of Panmunjom, between enemy lines. Right away, it was obvious that the negotiations would be as torturous as the war itself. Both sides came to the table acting as the victor, pressing the other to make concessions expected of the loser. Their objectives differed drastically. The UN wanted a new border drawn along current front lines. The Communists called for a return to the 38th parallel. The Chinese demanded that all their prisoners be returned, even against their will. But the Reds had slaughtered most of the UN captives they had taken. Of the more than 100,000 UN soldiers thought captured by the Reds, only about 13,000 came back. Relieved just to be alive, those lucky few told horrifying tales of torture, brainwashing, and severe hunger. They talked about the Chinese campaign to re-educate them and turn them against the cause of democracy. They were forced at gunpoint to speak out against America on the radio. And they described prison camps where there was no medicine and rampant disease. Thousands went crazy. Thousands more starved to death. Across the front line, UN prisons were safer and better organized. The most threatening enemy within these camps were not the guards, but other prisoners. Chinese inmates split into pro- and anti-communist factions. Often their animosity toward each other turned deadly, and the communists back at the peace table used the discord in these camps as propaganda against the United Nations. The talks continually broke down. Neither side would budge on anything, and when progress stalled at Panmunjom, tensions heightened on the front lines. Heavy displays of force were a way of reinforcing diplomatic sincerity. The last 2 years of the war were a series of highly charged skirmishes fueled by impatience, frustration, and resentment. But between the periods of intense fighting, there were countless idle hours of waiting. Troops on both sides passed the time by reinforcing their positions. Barracks were built and foxholes dug all over Central Korea. The dirt from the foxholes filled the sandbags that were stacked to build bunkers. And from these bunkers high in the hills, troops kept watch on the enemy, who was spying back on them from across the valley. While playing the waiting game, troops took photos of Korean vistas to take home with them. When they weren't building better bunkers or snapping photos, troops would write letters home or attend religious services, praying for their lost buddies, but never for themselves.
You pray for your friends that they might be spared. For yourself, you pray that if you're killed, it'll be quick and merciful. You never prayed, "Spare me, God, and I'll be good." It would sound selfish if you prayed that you wanted to be spared. Doug Koch, Private First Class.
In these hills, if there was one selfish wish worth praying for, it was to always hold the high ground. And in the summer of 1952, the 8th Army had their sights set on the hills ahead of them. If they could just advance to the next ridge, that would be enough, until they saw the ridge ahead of that. But the enemy had the same idea, and for the last 2 years of the war, the same few hills were fought over until they turned blood red. Among the most famous of the hills was Old Baldy, so named for being swept clean by endless artillery fire. The hill offered a bird's-eye view for miles to the north and south. In June 1952, a game of King of the Hill began when the UN unleashed an operation to take Old Baldy. The infantry stormed the hill amidst enemy fire and put its stakes down on top, but the Chinese kept coming back with strong challenges. After 9 months of an exhausting seesaw struggle, they were finally repelled for good. Soldiers all over the perimeter were fighting in clashes like these, hoping to scare the enemy into compromise at the peace table. But the talks at Panmunjom went on and off with no progress. If negotiations were going to get anywhere, UN forces needed to find a better way to put pressure on the Reds. So they turned to their most obvious advantage: air power. If there was one unquestionable imbalance in this war, it was UN air superiority. From the first day of UN intervention in Korea until the final day of battle, American aircraft pulverized North Korea ceaselessly from above. Most planes in the UN fleet were built during World War II, like the B-29 Super Fortresses that still dominated bombing operations. But a new generation of U.S. fighter planes was gradually being introduced and kept pilots a step ahead of the enemy. Jet planes like the F-86 Sabre ushered in a new era for aerial combat and quickly became the air war's main attraction. They replaced slower fighters with a more aerodynamic wing design, and they were faster and deadlier than anything that came before them. With the world's greatest aces in their cockpits, UN jets ruled the skies. In 1952, UN air power reached its peak strength. The U.S. Air Force had nearly 1,500 planes flying missions that year, and more from the Navy, Marines, and other UN squadrons. That summer, a massive show of force was unleashed over North Korean skies, meant to force the communist hand at the peace table. The Air Force descended on a remote corner of North Korea just below the Yalu, where the country's largest industrial targets were hidden. But this was where the Chinese had their only strong fleet of fighter planes, so UN pilots were prepared for anything. On June 23rd, U.S. dive bombers and jets launched an intense string of attacks on several major industrial centers. The primary targets were hydroelectric plants. Air Force Sabres flew top cover on the lookout for Chinese MiGs, while bombers moved in and hit the plants. The attacks were swift, sudden, and perfectly executed. When the smoke cleared 2 days later, 90% of North Korea's electrical capacity had been destroyed. These airstrikes would stand as the most vital of the war, and they didn't escape the notice of South Korea's leader, Syngman Rhee.
Your planes hit enemy military centers. They hit the communist columns. Everybody knows that American planes played the most important part in this war.
Air Force barrages would continue to pound the communists until the day the armistice was signed. But while they gave the UN some leverage at the peace table, they weren't quite enough to close the deal. To do that would require a whole new dealmaker. Korea was the hot-button issue of the 1952 American presidential campaign. With voters running low on patience, the Democrats faced an uphill challenge against the Republican nominee, legendary General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Ike had commanded Allied forces in Europe during World War II and had retired earlier in the year from America's most prestigious command. Even MacArthur played second fiddle to Ike. Harry Truman had served as president for more than 7 years and decided not to seek another term. As the Korean conflict entered its third year, Americans were afraid the war would drag on forever and wanted a leader who could end it quickly. In a late October stump speech, Eisenhower managed to put their fears to rest.
I shall go to Korea. Only in that way could I learn how best to serve the American people in the cause of peace.
After his victory, President-elect Eisenhower made good on his promise. He donned army fatigues and met with troops near the front lines. He ate rations with privates and listened to their thoughts on ending the war. There were rumors circulating in the press that Ike would use the atomic bomb to force an armistice, as Truman had in World War II. To capitalize on the speculation, Eisenhower started to drop hints that this was a real possibility. Up to this point in the war, the communists had been emboldened by the UN's self-imposed limitations. But they took Ike's nuclear warnings seriously. Just 3 months after Eisenhower's inauguration, the Chinese cracked. They sent a letter declaring their desire to end the war. But the war's finale would be as tense as its beginning. The armistice took another 4 months to iron out. Along the front, soldiers on both sides knew the end was near and wanted to go out with the best field position possible. Hostilities broke out across the peninsula in last-ditch attempts to gain ground. The armistice was finally signed on July 27, 1953, more than 3 years after the war began. It divided the peninsula along the front lines, in effect giving the UN a small victory. In the field, artillery blasts kept rolling for another 12 hours until the agreement took effect. Then, all was quiet. More than 3 million casualties fell on the hills of Korea over the war's 3 years, counting civilians and servicemen, wounded, killed, or missing. The land of the morning calm had been ravaged by death and destruction. With participants from more than 20 countries fighting on one side or the other, this struggle, remembered by most as a minor stalemate, was in fact a world war in its own right. The global fight against communism that would last for 40 years began here, in the wilds of this small Asian peninsula. But unlike the Cold War it provoked, the Korean War goes on to this day. Soldiers from both sides still patrol the armistice lines in Central Korea. Things there haven't changed all that much since that spring of 1950. Today, Korea is the only place in the world where a war is officially being fought. But despite Korea's lingering ambiguities, The men and women who served there were among the bravest and most selfless warriors in military history. Their legacy is one of courage in the face of despair, conviction in a time of indifference, and persistence in the face of overwhelming adversity. Unto these brave soldiers we owe our deepest gratitude.